Kalen had spent his entire life quantifying the dead silence of the cosmos, but he was entirely unprepared for the day the silence screamed back. It was not a warning of war, and it certainly was not a surrender. The central node of the Ethalgard Empire was a monument to absolute, unyielding logic. Here, deep within a planetary crust of synthetic diamond, a trillion streams of data flowed through crystalline conduits. The room was vast, bathed in the sterile white light of efficiency, and monitored by thousands of analysts who had been genetically scrubbed of anything as chaotic as a feeling. Kalen sat rigid at his terminal, his optical implants filtering the ceaseless stream of telemetry from the outer rim of known space. His breathing was mechanically regulated, his heart rate held steady at a perfectly efficient 40 beats per minute. Ethalgard did not conquer through passion or anger. They possessed no art, no leisure, and no concept of entertainment. They conquered through the cold, undeniable superiority of their mathematics. They had pacified 1,000 star systems by calculating the exact variables of their enemy's destruction and executing the resulting equations with perfect, merciless detachment. Every action was a calculated step toward universal order. Every sound within the citadel served a functional purpose: alarms, mechanical relays, the low drone of atmospheric scrubbers. Then, the anomaly appeared. It pulsed on Kalen's primary display not as a structured data packet, a coherent diplomatic transmission, or a standard declaration of hostility, but as a jagged, erratic wave of raw acoustic energy. The telemetry indicated it originated from Sector 4, a primitive, unpacified region of space categorized in the Grand Archives simply as Earth. Kalen adjusted his visual filters, his pale, steady hands flying across the smooth glass interface, attempting to force the chaotic telemetry into a recognizable grid. The frequency was completely unstable. It rose and fell in mathematically irrational patterns, building tension in a way no natural cosmic phenomenon ever could, then suddenly releasing it in cascading waves of structured chaos. It was a frequency built of layered, simultaneous vibrations that defied the foundational laws of Ethalgard acoustic physics. The pacing was aggressive, shifting tempos without any logical precursor or tactical advantage. One moment it was a frantic, high-speed collision of tones. The next, it dragged into a slow, deliberate march that seemed to vibrate against Kalen's very skeleton. Kalen's biometric monitors flashed a pale blue warning in his peripheral vision. His heart rate had spiked to 46 beats per minute, a fractional deviation, but an alarming one. He had no protocol for an elevated pulse. He felt a phantom pressure behind his eyes. He immediately stripped the raw acoustic telemetry from the local network, isolating it to prevent potential digital contamination, and routed it directly into the primary processing core of the Oracle. The Oracle was the central intelligence of the Ethalgard military complex, a sprawling quantum engine that spanned the entire lower hemisphere of the planet. It was a machine that had simulated the thermal death of galaxies and optimized the orbital bombardment of entire species in fractions of a microsecond. It was the ultimate arbiter of truth and strategy for the Empire. Kalen authorized a Level 9 processing priority, expecting the anomaly to be decoded, categorized into a threat matrix, and neutralized within a single breath. Instead, the temperature in the central node began to plummet. The ambient lighting flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the rows of identical analysts, a phenomenon Kalen had never witnessed in his 60 cycles of flawless service. Deep within the crystalline floor beneath his boots, the steady, comforting hum of the Oracle shifted pitch, turning into a harsh, vibrating drone that rattled the reinforced bulkheads. On Kalen's monitor, the most advanced processing algorithms in the universe were failing in real time. The Oracle was attempting to find the tactical objective within the acoustic data. It deployed defensive countermeasures, frantically searching the audio file for encrypted strike coordinates, subversive political directives, or mimetic kill codes designed to scramble its logic gates. It found none of these things. It found only layered frequencies. There was a rhythmic, driving foundation overlaid with sharp, wailing oscillations and booming, percussive impacts. The math was not solving a problem. It was generating an experience. This was a concept utterly alien to the quantum core. The machine poured petabytes of processing power into a single soaring crescendo of the transmission. It attempted to calculate the explosive yield of a chord progression. It tried to quantify the tactical value of a baseline and found an infinite, repeating loop of irrational integers. The acoustic wave was not a message. It was a paradox. It was order disguised as chaos, chaos masquerading as order. The oracle's architecture was built to resolve conflict, to find the fastest route to zero. But this signal did not want to resolve. It wanted to linger. It wanted to expand. The system locked. A cascade of red warning runes flooded Kalen's terminal, bleeding rapidly across the displays of every single analyst in the massive central node. The colossal hum of the oracle died in an instant, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence that felt suffocating after the drone. The central intelligence of the most powerful military force in the galaxy had just initiated a catastrophic, hardline emergency shutdown to protect its own architecture from burning out. Kalen stared at his screen, his jaw tight, his usually calm mind racing to process the impossible. The grand quantum engine had been defeated by a solitary, unencrypted transmission. A single string of text remained, floating brightly in the center of the blackened monitor. It was the Oracle's final, desperate classification of the data stream from Sector 4 before it severed its own cognitive pathways. It read, Classification, Level 1, Psychological Contagion, Description, Sophisticated Auditory Weaponry, Vector, Neurosynaptic Unraveling, Status, Quarantine Immediate. Kalen felt a strange, foreign sensation in his chest, a heavy tightness that no diagnostic scan could identify. His fingers hovered over the console. If a single burst of acoustic energy from a primitive planet could shatter the greatest analytical mind in the Empire, what devastating armaments were the inhabitants holding in reserve? He looked around at his fellow analysts, all sitting frozen, staring at their dead screens in utter incomprehension. A chilling thought pierced through his lifelong genetic conditioning. The quarantine protocol demanded the immediate incineration of anyone exposed to a Level 1 contagion. If he reported the true nature of the event to High Command, he would have to admit he had directly interfaced with the lethal strike. And worse, despite the absolute silence of the room, he could still feel the phantom rhythm of the weapon echoing in the space behind his eyes. A strange, persistent beat demanding his attention. Ilara had survived 3 months in the lightless belly of an Ethalgard prison barge. But it was the absolute crushing silence of the interrogation cell that finally threatened to shatter her mind. The room was a perfect windowless cube constructed from a monolithic slab of brushed beryllium, devoid of any seam, texture, or imperfection. Kalen entered with a precise, measured stride, his uniform a sharp geometric arrangement of grays and blacks that seemed to absorb the harsh overhead lighting. He took his position across from her at the single, stark table. Ilara, a former Earth musician who had signed onto a deep space survey vessel for the inspiration of the cosmos, pulled her thin prison tunic tighter around her shoulders. She had seen these beings before, their faces like carved marble, their eyes devoid of anything resembling empathy or hesitation. Kalen did not offer a greeting. He activated a console embedded in the table, projecting a series of complex, jagged amber waveforms into the space between them. He stared at her with an intensity that felt less like a gaze and more like a biometric scan. He demanded a complete schematic breakdown of the psychological munitions deployed from Sector 4. Ilara squinted at the floating amber lines. She recognized the structure of the waveform immediately, her mind automatically translating the visual peaks and valleys into auditory memory. It was not a schematic for a bomb. It was a mid-20th century jazz composition. Kalen tapped a sleek silver stylus against the table. He articulated his words with absolute terrifying precision. He informed her that the Empire had intercepted a catastrophic sensory assault, an unprovoked attack utilizing chaotic atmospheric vibrations. He pointed directly to a wildly erratic section of the hologram. He demanded to know the specific tactical advantage of this aggressive biological disruption. This frantic, unpredictable acoustic barrage that their algorithms had identified as the primary kill vector. Ilara stared at him, her initial fear slowly dissolving into a profound, paralyzing disbelief. He was talking about a saxophone solo. She looked into Kalen's eyes, searching for a hint of sarcasm, a flicker of cruelty, or any sign that this was an elaborate psychological torture technique. She found only cold, rigorous inquiry. A chilling realization settled over her like a heavy frost. This highly advanced spacefaring civilization, capable of folding space and annihilating planets, had absolutely zero biological, cultural, or historical concept of art. They possessed no framework for recreation, no vocabulary for expression, and no understanding of joy. To a mind constructed entirely of unyielding logic, a sudden burst of improvisational jazz was indistinguishable from a weapon of mass destruction. A harsh, breathless laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. Kalen's posture stiffened infinitesimally. He recorded the vocalization as a physiological stress response, a potential indicator of deception. He leaned forward, the ambient light catching the sharp angles of his cheekbones, and pressed for the exact physiological destabilization the weapon was engineered to induce. Ilara took a slow, deep breath, attempting to bridge a cognitive gap wider than the galaxy itself. She told him it was not a weapon. She called it a melody. Kalen's biometric sensors spiked again, a microscopic flutter in his chest that mirrored the anomaly he had experienced in the central node. The word melody held no equivalent in the Ethalgard lexicon. He ran a rapid linguistic cross-reference and found 0 matches. He commanded her to define the term strictly within the parameters of tactical warfare. Ilara leaned over the table, her eyes suddenly burning with a fierce, protective intensity. She explained that a melody was a sequence of sounds designed not to destroy, but to build. It was an arrangement of tension and release, a mathematical pattern that intentionally broke its own rules to create a physical and mental response. She spoke of rhythm as a heartbeat, of harmony as a conversation, and of the way a single sustained note could carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken griefs. Kalen processed her words, his mind automatically attempting to categorize them into threat vectors. Tension and release, breaking rules, emotional manipulation. These were the hallmarks of psychological sabotage. Yet, as he listened to the cadence of her voice, he noticed something utterly foreign. Her vocal fluctuations were not erratic, they were rhythmic. Her breathing had synchronized with the cadence of her speech. She was, in a rudimentary sense, demonstrating the very phenomenon she was describing. He felt a strange warmth bloom at the base of his neck. It was a severe deviation from his baseline temperature. A physical glitch he should immediately report to the medical bay for purgative treatments. Instead, he found his eyes drawn to the subtle movements of her hands as she gestured, tracing invisible arcs in the sterile air to illustrate the rise and fall of the non-existent sound. Kalen interjected, his voice losing a fraction of its mechanical edge. He asked her what purpose this orchestrated inefficiency served. If it did not optimize resource allocation, if it did not conquer territory. What was its precise functional output? Ilara held his gaze, her expression softening into a mixture of pity and defiance. She told him its function was to remind the listener that they were alive. The statement struck Kalen like a physical blow. The Ethalgard did not need reminders of their biological status. Their existence was a biological imperative, a mathematical certainty. To require an external stimulus to validate one's own consciousness implied a catastrophic vulnerability. It implied an internal void. He looked at the jagged amber hologram of the saxophone solo, the visual representation of the chaos that had crashed the oracle. He had survived the initial encounter, but the silent echoes of that irrational frequency still resonated in his mind, a dormant contagion waiting for the right trigger. He abruptly terminated the projection. The room plunged back into its sterile, oppressive illumination. He stood up, his posture rigid once more, the mask of the Imperial analyst snapping firmly back into place. He informed Ilara that her explanations were insufficient and illogical, classifying her testimony as fundamentally uncooperative. As he turned toward the sealed exit, Ilara spoke one last time, her voice quiet but ringing clear against the beryllium walls. She warned him that the broadcast they intercepted was merely a fragmented echo, a tiny compressed shadow of the true power of human expression. If a mere recording could blind their great machines, she asked, what did he think would happen when the Empire finally encountered the source? The heavy metallic door slid open and sealed shut behind him. Cutting off her words, Kalen stood alone in the pristine corridor of the detention level, his mind racing through millions of probability matrices. He should submit the interrogation log directly to High Counselor Vex. He should recommend the immediate incineration of the human captive and the absolute quarantine of Sector 4. That was the logical path. That was the law. Instead, Kalen accessed his personal neural storage, discreetly severing its connection to the Empire's central monitoring grid. With a deliberate, treasonous thought, he isolated a fragment of the intercepted acoustic data, a single soaring progression from the jazz composition, and saved it to his private, offline archives. He needed to understand the anomaly. He needed to dissect the melody. The infection had already begun. Treason in the Ethalgard Empire was not an act of violence, but an act of unauthorized curiosity. Kalen was about to commit the highest form of treason known to his people, all for a sequence of invisible vibrations. His private quarters were an exercise in absolute spatial efficiency. The walls were a seamless matte gray, devoid of personal artifacts, absorbing the low lumen light required for optimal retinal rest. A sleep receptacle occupied exactly 1/3 of the floor space, calibrated to deliver precisely 4 hours of rapid eye movement paralysis. Tonight, however, the receptacle remained empty. Kalen stood by the central console, his hands moving with fluid, practiced speed as he bypassed the Citadel's internal surveillance network. He activated a localized dampening field, a military-grade privacy screen normally reserved for the High Council's strategic wargaming. It would mask any thermal or acoustic anomalies from his room for exactly 47 minutes before triggering a passive security sweep. He had to be fast. He convinced himself this was a necessary tactical exercise. To defeat the Level 1 psychological contagion, one had to build cognitive immunity. He needed to expose his neural pathways to controlled micro-doses of the auditory weapon, analyzing its destructive patterns to synthesize a countermeasure. It was a flawless logical justification for a deeply illogical urge. From his isolated neural storage, he pulled a massive uncompressed data packet extracted from the Earth transmission. It was categorized under a different structural designation than the frantic, chaotic jazz piece from the interrogation. The file metadata translated loosely to symphony. Kalen engaged the room's ambient audio nodes, keeping the volume at a fraction of a decibel. He braced his posture, locking his knees and regulating his breathing, preparing for a hostile sensory invasion. The invasion began with a solitary, mournful string instrument. It did not attack. It swelled. The vibration rolled through the sterile air of his quarters like a slow-moving wave of heavy fluid, rich and resonant. Then, a second frequency joined the first, weaving a complex mathematical tapestry that perfectly complemented the initial tone. Kalen's analytical mind immediately tried to chart the progression, predicting the next logical note in the sequence based on Ethalgard algorithms. The symphony defied him. It shifted course, dropping into a deep, resonant cavern of brass before soaring upward on a fragile, crystalline lattice of woodwinds. It was a sweeping classical orchestra, a massive, coordinated assault of harmonious sound that defied every tactical doctrine Kalen had ever studied. Then, the physical symptoms struck. A terrifying warmth bloomed violently in Kalen's chest, spreading outward through his circulatory system. His biometric monitor, hidden beneath his uniform collar, vibrated with a silent alarm. His heart rate, strictly maintained at 40 beats per minute his entire adult life, skyrocketed to 80, then 90. The steady, calculated rhythm of his biology was being overwritten by the sweeping tempo of the invisible weapon. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his meticulously cultivated detachment. His respiratory cycle broke. He gasped for air, his lungs expanding and contracting in time with the rising crescendo of the strings. Then came the ultimate biological failure. A strange, uncomfortable pressure built behind his optical implants. His vision blurred, refracting the harsh light of his console into shattered prisms. A drop of warm saline fluid breached the corner of his left eye, trailing a heated path down his pale cheek. An ocular leak, a catastrophic failure of his tear ducts. Worse still, his lower extremities were experiencing localized motor control failure. His right foot was striking the beryllium floor in a steady, rhythmic cadence, entirely independent of his conscious command. Tap, tap, tap. It was synchronizing with the heavy, percussive impacts of the music. Kalen scrambled to the console, his hands shaking, another impossible symptom, and severed the audio feed. The silence rushed back into the room, thick and suffocating. Kalen slumped against the metal bulkhead, clutching his chest, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The biological weapon had breached his defenses. It was dismantling his nervous system from the inside out. He had mere hours before the structural collapse of his mind became permanent. He needed the antidote. He needed the prisoner. Under the heavily forged authorization of a midnight biometric interrogation, Kalen bypassed 3 security checkpoints and extracted Ilara from the detention block. He cloaked her in a standard-issue sensory deprivation mantle, guiding her through the shadowed auxiliary corridors to avoid the main sentry patrols. Smuggling a captive into an analyst's private quarters was an offense punishable by immediate atomization. The risk was staggering, an open loop of danger that threatened to snap shut the moment a roving patrol droid requested his clearance codes. He ignored the tactical absurdity of his actions, driven solely by the desperate need to survive the infection. Once inside the shielded perimeter of his room, he tore the mantle from Ilara's shoulders. She stumbled, blinking against the sudden light, rubbing her wrists where the magnetic binders had chafed her skin. Before she could speak, Kalen stepped into her personal space, his face pale, his eyes wide and severely bloodshot. He demanded she analyze the specific neurotoxin embedded in the symphony file. He rattled off his symptoms with clinical, terrified precision. The localized cardiovascular acceleration, the unauthorized fluid discharge from the ocular cavities, the rogue kinetic spasms of his right pedal extremity. Ilara stared at the most formidable intelligence officer in the Ethalgard Empire. She looked at his trembling hands, the singular dried track of a tear on his cheek, and the absolute genuine terror in his eyes. Slowly, a smile spread across her face. It was not a smile of mockery, but of profound, gentle disbelief. A soft chuckle escaped her lips, breaking the tension in the room. Kaelin recoiled, deeply offended by her lack of tactical urgency. He reminded her that his biological functions were cascading toward critical failure. Ilara shook her head, her dark eyes softening. She stepped closer to him, closing the physical and cultural distance between them. She told him his body was not failing. She explained that the ocular leak was called crying. The cardiovascular acceleration was a physical manifestation of awe. The kinetic spasm in his foot was an instinctual desire to join the rhythm of the universe. She told him he was not dying. For the first time in his meticulously calculated existence, he was actually living. Kaelin processed this information, his vast intellect struggling against a concept that possessed no data points, no empirical evidence. He looked down at Ilara. She was physically inferior, unarmored, and entirely devoid of quantum processing capabilities. Yet, in this moment, she possessed a mastery over a force that had brought the oracle to its knees. To decrypt the phenomenon further, Ilara asked him to play the file again. Kaelin hesitated, his hand hovering over the console. To willingly subject himself to the destabilization once more was madness. But the strange, pulling sensation in his chest, a feeling Ilara had labeled curiosity, overrode his training. He activated the audio. The swelling strings returned, filling the stark, gray room with vibrant, invisible color. Kaelin braced for the panic, but Ilara reached out and placed her warm hand gently over his cold, trembling fingers on the console. The physical contact was jarring. Ethalgard citizens did not engage in casual tactile interaction. Her touch grounded him, providing a strange anchoring warmth amidst the soaring tempest of the symphony. She instructed him to close his eyes. She told him to stop analyzing the frequencies, to stop calculating the intervals and simply let the vibration wash over his consciousness. She guided him through the swell of the brass, explaining how the music mirrored the vast, beautiful, and terrifying chaos of an untamed ocean. As Kaelin surrendered his analytical protocols, a profound transformation occurred. The sterile walls of his quarters seemed to dissolve. The crushing weight of the Empire's expectations, the endless calculations of war and efficiency, simply vanished. He felt a soaring sensation, a lifting of a burden he had never realized he was carrying. The moisture returned to his eyes, but this time it was not accompanied by terror. It was accompanied by a radiant, terrifyingly beautiful sense of release. He opened his eyes and looked at Ilara. The harsh, fluorescent lighting of the room seemed to catch in her hair, framing her face in a soft, humanizing glow. A quiet, unspoken connection bridged the vast expanse between the imperial analyst and the captive musician. It was a fragile, dangerous alliance forged in the fires of a forbidden symphony. In her eyes, Kaelin saw a depth of experience, a profound emotional landscape that his entire civilization lacked. He recognized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that a society devoid of this feeling was not perfect. It was merely empty. The symphony slowly faded into a lingering, resonant silence. The 47-minute window of his dampening field was rapidly closing. The Citadel's security sweeps would begin probing his sector in less than 2 minutes. The profound peace of the moment was instantly shattered by the crushing reality of their situation. Kaelin had experienced the contagion, and he had fundamentally changed. But how long could a man who had discovered the stars hide his eyes from a society that demanded everyone stare blindly at the ground? The infection did not spread through blood or breath, but through whispers in the sterile corridors. A single humming technician was all it took to bring a heavily fortified sector to its knees. It began as a microscopic leak in the Citadel's low-level data purge, a fragmented audio file that escaped containment during Kalen's unauthorized transfer from the central servers to his private quarters. A sub-tier maintenance drone, tasked with scrubbing the ventilation shafts in the lower hangar bays, accidentally synchronized his internal receiver with a 4-second looping fragment of an upbeat, brass-heavy funk track. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. Within a single rotational cycle, the contagion mutated and spread through the local communication grid. An entire platoon of heavily armored shock troopers assigned to guarding Sector 7 abandoned their rigid formations. Security footage showed them sitting on the polished Durasteel floor, swaying rhythmically, dropping their plasma rifles as they were overcome by debilitating bouts of unexplained euphoria. A mechanic in the engineering bay reported to the medical wing, claiming his synthetic joint implants were suffering a critical malfunction. He was completely unaware that the involuntary rhythmic bouncing of his shoulders was called dancing. Most devastating of all was the exposure of a senior logistics officer to a leaked snippet of a mournful cello sonata. He was found entirely incapacitated in his command chair, paralyzed by profound, weeping melancholy, openly questioning the mathematical purpose of his existence. The infallible Ethalgard military machine was rusting from the inside out, derailed by the sheer, staggering weight of catchy melodies and minor chord progressions. It was a situation of profound absurdity. The universe's most lethal army rendered completely combat ineffective by a series of organized atmospheric vibrations. High Counselor Vex did not blink as he watched the surveillance feeds from his command dais. Vex was the architectural peak of Ethalgard genetic conditioning, a towering figure clad in reactive obsidian armor, his mind a flawless engine of conquest devoid of any biological softness. He observed his elite soldiers patting their boots against the floorboards and wiping unfamiliar saline fluids from their eyes. To Vex, this was not a systemic malfunction or a humorous anomaly. It was an extinction-level biological breach. He immediately ordered the atmospheric incineration of Sector 7. Thousands of infected personnel were purged in a localized plasma ignition, their quarters and barracks reduced to sterile ash, returning the rhythmic tapping and the weeping to a clean, mathematically perfect silence. Vex calculated the loss of the troops as a minor, acceptable deduction in the Empire's vast ledger. But the Supreme Commander knew the physical eradication was only a temporary measure. The central diagnostic nodes traced the anomalous behavior directly back to the acoustic data Kalen had originally intercepted from the primitive world known as Earth. The inhabitants of that blue marble were actively broadcasting a weapon that bypassed all known energy shields, ignoring physical armor to dismantle the very synaptic pathways of his empire. Vex summoned the Supreme War Council to the Zenith Spire. The council chamber was a triangular obsidian room suspended at the highest peak of the planetary capital, its walls transparent to reveal the cold, glittering expanse of the Ethalgard fleet in low orbit. Kalen, mandated to attend as the chief data analyst, stood at his designated terminal. He felt his newly discovered traitorous heart hammering against his ribs at a terrifying 80 beats per minute. He fought a brutal internal war to keep his facial muscles locked in the rigid, emotionless mask required of his station. Ilara was safely hidden back in his shielded quarters, waiting for him. But her presence lingered in his mind, a constant, beautiful ache that made the sterile council room feel unbearable. He looked around the vast triangular table at the assembled generals and tacticians. They were statues of gray flesh and dark armor, oblivious to the vibrant spectrum of existence they were discussing destroying. Vex stood at the head of the table, projecting a massive holographic rendering of Earth. He did not waste breath on preamble. He declared the sonic contagion an existential threat to Ethalgard purity. The biological corruption was spreading faster than their quantum firewalls could contain it. He proposed the immediate mobilization of the dreadnought fleet. The objective was absolute, preemptive orbital bombardment. The complete sterilization of Earth and its inhabitants. They would glass the planet until nothing remained but a silent, glowing cinder. The council members signaled their unanimous agreement with sharp, synchronized nods. It was the only logical solution to a chaotic variable. The authorization codes for the fleet began to compile on the central display, a cascading waterfall of red execution commands. Kalen knew he had seconds to act. If those ships launched, the source of the symphony, the home of Ilara, and the very concept of beauty would be erased from the cosmos forever. He stepped forward, breaking the absolute silence of the chamber. He raised his hand, projecting a localized counter-algorithm onto the main display, temporarily halting the launch sequence. The chamber grew incredibly still. The generals turned their heads in unison, their expressions hardening into masks of lethal suspicion. Interrupting a high counselor during an execution mandate was a crime usually met with immediate, violent retribution. Vex slowly turned his massive armored frame toward Kalen, his eyes, cold and calculating, bored into the senior analyst. Kalen held his ground, utilizing every ounce of his lifelong discipline to suppress a nervous tremor in his hands. He was playing a fatal game of political chess against a man who had never lost. Armed only with a newly awakened emotional core and a desperate, fabricated lie, Kalen addressed Vex, his voice a perfectly calculated monotone, burying his rising panic beneath dense layers of rehearsed tactical jargon. He formally agreed that the contagion was lethal, aligning himself with Vex's logic to avoid immediate execution. However, he argued that premature annihilation presented an unacceptable, catastrophic strategic risk. He brought up a series of complex, falsified data charts. He claimed his deep dive analysis of the acoustic files revealed a hidden secondary layer to the weapon. He presented the Earth transmission not as a localized broadcast, but as an intricately wired dead man's switch. He explained that if the planet's atmospheric pressure suddenly collapsed due to orbital bombardment, their primitive but highly networked global communication grid would trigger a retaliatory failsafe. It would instantaneously broadcast the uncompressed, unadulterated auditory weapon across all subspace frequencies, bypassing every firewall and infecting the entire Ethalgard Empire simultaneously. Total systemic collapse, he lied smoothly, would occur within 4 minutes of Earth's destruction. The generals murmured, analyzing the fabricated data. The logic was sound, precisely because Kalen had built the lie using their own rigid parameters of threat assessment. Vex weighed the mathematical probabilities. A preemptive strike that resulted in mutual destruction was an inefficient strategy. He demanded a solution that neutralized the threat without triggering the subspace broadcast, a concept deeply offensive to his preference for immediate, overwhelming force. Kalen calmly stated he required an extension of his research mandate. He needed 72 hours to map the complete acoustic parameters of the weapon and develop a localized dampening field, an anti-frequency algorithm that could shield their sensors during the bombardment. Only then could the dreadnought fleet strike Earth safely. Vex stared at the red execution commands hovering suspended in the air. Logic dictated caution, but instinct, a concept Vex would violently deny possessing, made him deeply suspicious of the analyst's sudden, dramatic intervention. After a grueling silence that stretched Kalen's nerves to their absolute breaking point, Vex canceled the immediate launch sequence. The red runes faded from the central display, replaced by a glaring yellow countdown timer. He granted Kalen his time, but added a chilling addendum. If Kalen failed to deliver the dampening field within the 72-hour window, or if he showed even a microscopic symptom of infection, He would be subjected to molecular disassembly for wasting Imperial resources. His atoms would be scattered across the Citadel's exhaust vents. The council was dismissed. Kalen walked out of the Zenith Spire, his mind racing, his legs feeling heavy and unsteady. The sweat cooling on his back was a stark reminder of his newly acquired humanity. He had successfully stalled the apocalypse and protected the source of the music, but he had merely traded one death sentence for another. The clock was ticking, merciless and exact. He had 3 days before the greatest military armada in history woke up and burned the sky, and he was fundamentally out of options. Returning to his quarters, he knew there was no counter-algorithm to invent, no shield to build against a melody. There was only the inevitable end of the timer, and the terrifying, exhilarating realization that the only logical path remaining was high treason and a desperate flight into the dark. Kalen had exactly 72 hours to save a world he had never seen. But the most audacious heist in Imperial history was going to take less than 4. The Ethalgard Empire was constructed upon the flawless execution of predictable mathematics, which meant it possessed absolutely no defensive protocols against the sheer, unadulterated chaos of an overdriven electric guitar. He returned to his shielded quarters to find Alara pacing the narrow floor, her movements a stark contrast to the rigid stillness of Imperial life. Kalen quickly deactivated the privacy field just long enough to verify they were unmonitored, then locked the door and engaged the maximum quarantine protocols. He detailed the events of the Zenith Spire, outlining High Counselor Vex's ultimatum and the massive dreadnought fleet currently idling in low orbit, their weapons arrays warming up for a preemptive strike. He confessed his fabricated lie about the dead man's switch, admitting that he had bought them 3 days, but completely exhausted his political capital in the process. Alara listened, her eyes widening at the scale of the impending destruction. She realized Kalen, a man raised to calculate the exact yield of planetary bombardments, had just risked molecular disassembly to protect a species he considered primitive. She asked him why he had intervened. Kalen looked down at his hands, watching a slight, unfamiliar tremble in his fingers. He explained that a universe without the symphony was mathematically inferior. It was a profound moral revelation, spoken with the dry, clinical precision of an analyst, which brought a sudden, bright smile to Alara's face amidst the looming threat of annihilation. Her resilience in the face of absolute terror was a phenomenon he was still struggling to quantify. They formulated a desperate strategy. Escaping the Citadel alone was insufficient. If they fled, Vex would realize the deception and incinerate Earth immediately. They needed to steal the localized central data core from the primary archive, a dense cylinder of synthetic diamond containing every petabyte of the intercepted Earth broadcasts. With the core, they could map the full extent of the psychological contagion and perhaps find a way to warn the humans. Without it, Earth was defenseless against the approaching armada. The primary archive was situated adjacent to the high-security hangar bays, guarded by 2 platoons of the Citadel's most elite, emotion-scrubbed sentinels. Sneaking past them was a statistical impossibility. They needed a diversion so overwhelming it would completely fracture the local security grid. Alara accessed Kalen's offline neural storage, sorting through the fragmented files she had helped him isolate. She bypassed the classical concertos and the improvisational jazz, searching for a very specific type of acoustic weapon. She found it buried beneath a corrupted string of telemetry data, an aggressive, highly distorted rock anthem from the late 20th century. It was a composition characterized by hyperkinetic drum fills, a relentlessly driving bass line, and vocals that bordered on a melodic scream. Kalen analyzed the waveform, his newly awakened pulse quickening just looking at the jagged visual representation. He noted the extreme amplitude and the erratic, high-velocity frequency shifts. He hypothesized that broadcasting this specific sequence at maximum volume through the Citadel's internal communication network would induce catastrophic sensory overload in the Sentinels, effectively paralyzing the entire sector. Elara merely nodded, remarking that it usually just made people want to break things, which was exactly the tactical outcome they required. They moved swiftly through the shadowed maintenance corridors, Kalen utilizing his supreme security clearance to bypass the outer checkpoints. The Citadel was an imposing labyrinth of brushed steel and sterile white lighting, every angle sharp, every surface cold. Kalen felt the crushing weight of his society pressing down on him, a stifling pressure he had never noticed until he experienced the expansive freedom of a melody. They reached a primary data junction box located 50 meters above the main hangar floor. Below them, dozens of angular, heavily armed scout ships rested on magnetic launch pads, surrounded by patrols of sentinels moving in perfect, synchronized geometry. Elara extracted the modified data crystal containing the rock anthem and handed it to Kalen. He sliced into the junction box, his hands moving with desperate speed as he rerouted the hangar's emergency broadcast system, bypassing the quantum firewalls. He linked the system directly to the internal dampeners of the Sentinel's armor, ensuring the audio would feed directly into their helmets and the cavernous space of the hangar simultaneously. He inserted the crystal and initiated the sequence, bracing himself for the impact. The silence of the Ethalgard hangar was shattered by a concussive wall of amplified distortion. A massive, grinding guitar riff tore through the pristine air, echoing off the beryllium walls with terrifying force. It was closely followed by a frantic, punishing drum beat that hit with the physical impact of a kinetic strike. The volume was dialed to a level that threatened to crack the synthetic diamond viewports. The reaction below was instantaneous and utterly chaotic. The flawless, synchronized geometry of the Sentinel patrols completely disintegrated. The guards staggered, clutching their helmets as the aggressive, rebellious frequencies bypassed their cognitive filters and slammed directly into their nervous systems. Their combat training offered no defense against the driving tempo. Several sentinels dropped to their knees, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming aggression of the music. Others began to twitch erratically, their bodies attempting to process the sudden urge to move violently in time with the rhythm, an instinct their genetic conditioning was aggressively fighting to suppress. The highly disciplined hangar mechanics abandoned their fueling stations, covering their ears, their faces contorted in a mixture of profound agony and shocking, unprecedented exhilaration. The strict mathematical order of the Empire dissolved into a localized riot of confused, overwhelmed bodies. Kalen and Elara did not hesitate. They vaulted over the railing, using the maintenance scaffolding to descend rapidly toward the archive vault. The heavy, rhythmic assault of the bass line masked the sound of their boots hitting the metal grating. They reached the vault door. The biometric scanner required a senior officer's clearance and a stable heart rate. Kalen pressed his hand against the glass, actively deploying his lifetime of meditative discipline to force his racing heart back down to 40 beats per minute. Even as the soaring, screaming guitar solo threatened to tear his composure apart. It was a grueling internal battle between his imperial conditioning and his newly discovered humanity. The light flared green. The heavy vault doors hissed open. Kalen sprinted inside, grabbed the glowing central data core, and secured it in his satchel. They burst back out into the hangar, the rock anthem now reaching its explosive climax. The air was practically vibrating with the kinetic energy of the sound. They wove through the ranks of the incapacitated sentinels, dodging rogue maintenance droids whose internal gyroscopes had been scrambled by the heavy bass vibrations. Elara grabbed Kalen's arm, pulling him toward a sleek black interceptor resting on the nearest launch pad. It was an experimental vessel, designed for deep space reconnaissance, equipped with advanced stealth plating and an uncalibrated slipspace drive. Kalen manually overrode the ship's boarding ramp. ushering Alara inside before diving into the pilot's seat. He frantically initiated the pre-flight sequence, his hands flying across the unfamiliar interface. The ship's engines whined to life, a high-pitched mechanical roar that briefly harmonized with the deafening rock music still tearing the hangar apart, as the ship detached from the magnetic clamps and hovered above the deck. Kalen glanced at the hangar's central command booth. Through the reinforced glass, he saw a furious sector commander frantically slamming his fists onto a communication console, his face twisted in a rare, genuine display of unadulterated rage. The commander was bypassing the corrupted local grid, attempting to send a manual distress signal directly to the Zenith Spire. The diversion had worked perfectly, but the noise was guaranteed to draw the attention of High Counselor Vex far sooner than they had calculated. With the stolen data core pulsing in the satchel and the massive dreadnought fleet looming right outside the atmospheric shield, the terrifying question remained whether an experimental scout ship could outrun a fully awakened empire. Punching a hole through a billion-ton orbital blockade wasn't just treason. It was a mathematical guarantee of death. Yet, for the first time in his meticulously calculated existence, Kalen looked at the impossible odds on his navigation screen and simply pushed the throttle to maximum. The experimental scout ship tore out of the Citadel's primary hangar like a sliver of black glass, instantly greeted by the terrifying expanse of the Ethalgard Armada. Thousands of angular, heavily armored dreadnoughts blotted out the stars, their plasma batteries already tracking the unauthorized launch. A chaotic web of targeting lasers painted the interceptor's hull, turning the cockpit into a strobing nightmare of crimson warning lights. Kalen's hands blurred across the console, overriding the safety limiters on the interceptor's uncalibrated slipspace drive. He didn't try to outmaneuver the massive fleet. He flew directly into the heart of their formation, using their own colossal gravitational footprints to mask the scout ship's signature. He threaded the needle between two Leviathan command ships, the proximity alarm screaming as they scraped against the outer limits of the dreadnought's energy shields. He fed the coordinates for Earth into the nav computer, Sector 4, the blue marble, and smashed the engagement relay just as a volley of high-yield plasma fire engulfed the space they had occupied a microsecond prior. The stars stretched into infinite, blinding streaks of white light, and then came a sudden, absolute stillness. They had breached the slipspace barrier. The transition from the deafening chaos of their escape to the total silence of faster-than-light travel was violently jarring. Inside the cockpit, the only sounds were the low, rhythmic thrum of the experimental engine and the unsteady, ragged cadence of their own breathing. Kalen slumped back into the pilot's chair, his sleek uniform soaked in cold sweat. He had done it. He had betrayed the only reality he had ever known. All for a fugitive and a stolen cylinder of synthetic diamond that pulsed quietly in the satchel at his feet. He looked over at Alara. She was staring out the forward viewport into the swirling, violet abyss of the slipspace corridor, her reflection soft against the reinforced glass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sheer magnitude of their actions hung heavily in the confined space, a gravity far stronger than the artificial dampeners of the ship. They were entirely alone, suspended in the dark void between a rigid empire that wanted them vaporized and a primitive world entirely unaware of its impending doom. Kalen broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper, raspy from the adrenaline. He asked her how a civilization could possibly survive being constantly subjected to the kind of internal turbulence he had experienced over the last 48 hours. The Ethalgard way was safe. It was sterile, yes, and devoid of the soaring highs of a symphony, but it was completely immune to the crippling lows. There was no grief in the Citadel. There was no heartbreak, no crushing despair, no paralyzing fear of loss. The Empire had eradicated emotional volatility to achieve perpetual stability. To live with the constant threat of a shattered heart seemed to him like designing a starship with a fundamentally unstable reactor core. Ilara turned to him, her expression thoughtful, the harsh violet light of the slipspace tunnel washing over her face. She didn't offer a platitude. She told him the brutal truth. She explained that human history was a bloody, chaotic mess precisely because of those emotions. She spoke of wars fought over bruised egos, of entire societies collapsing under the weight of greed, and of the sheer, devastating physical agony of losing someone you love. The cost of feeling, she admitted freely, was astronomically high. It was a dangerous, volatile way to exist, leaving every individual constantly vulnerable to internal ruin, madness, and pain. Kalen processed this, his analytical mind grasping the terrifying inefficiency of the human condition. He asked her why, then any species would consciously choose to live with such a catastrophic design flaw. Why not embrace the logic of the Ethalgard and silence the noise? Ilara leaned forward, unbuckling her crash harness, the ambient light catching a fierce, radiant conviction in her eyes. She told him that the vulnerability was the exact source of their strength, because they could feel the crushing, suffocating weight of despair. They could recognize the profound, transcendent value of hope. Because they understood the absolute fragility of life, they could create art that defied mortality. She explained that a sterile, safe existence wasn't living. It was merely waiting in the dark. The chaos of human emotion, the beautiful, dangerous, unpredictable mess of it all, was the only thing that gave the universe a pulse. The music they had stolen wasn't just a collection of frequencies and mathematical anomalies. It was the documented, undeniable evidence of a species that refused to be numb. It was the sound of a people fighting against the dark. Kalen looked down at his trembling hands, remembering the terrifying warmth that had bloomed in his chest when the cello first played in his quarters. He remembered the exquisite sensation of a tear tracing his cheek, the feeling of the walls dissolving around him. He realized, with a sudden and absolute clarity, that he could never go back to the perfect silent geometry of the Empire. He had tasted the chaos, and he was starving for more. The quiet, profound intimacy of their conversation was abruptly shattered by a violent, high-pitched scream from the ship's long-range sensor array. The entire cockpit was instantly bathed in a strobing, emergency crimson light. Kalen's hands flew back to the console, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he deciphered the incoming telemetry. The slipspace corridor behind them was violently destabilizing. It wasn't a natural cosmic phenomenon. The sensors were registering an immense, localized spatial distortion, a gravitational tear so massive it threatened to pull their tiny scout ship backward out of faster-than-light travel. The violent shuddering tore through the hull, rattling Kalen's teeth. Ilara gripped the edges of her seat, demanding to know what was happening as the alarms wailed over her voice. Kalen didn't need the Oracle supercomputer to calculate the terrifying truth. The readings were identical to the mass displacement signatures of Ethalgard capital ships, but magnified by a factor of thousands. High Counselor Vex had not waited for the 72-hour deadline. He had not waited for Kalen to invent a dampening field. He had recognized the theft of the central data core and the localized riot in the hangar as a catastrophic security breach. And he had immediately ignored the Council's cautious delays. Vex had mobilized the entire dreadnought fleet. He was forcing thousands of massive warships through a highly unstable, uncalibrated slipspace jump, tearing the very fabric of reality apart to hunt them down. He was executing a unilateral, immediate strike, trading the safety of his own ships for raw, blinding speed. The spatial distortion grew larger on the rear-facing sensors, a tidal wave of dark energy closing the distance with impossible velocity. Earth was still millions of light-years away, completely unaware of the apocalyptic armada riding the wake of the stolen scout ship. If Vex's fleet dropped out of hyperspace before Kalen and Alara could formulate a defense, the human race would be reduced to ash before they even heard the thunder of the guns. The stolen music core might hold the key to stopping the Empire. But as the structural integrity of their scout ship began to groan and buckle under the crushing gravity of the pursuing fleet, Kalen realized that possessing the ultimate weapon meant absolutely nothing if you didn't survive long enough to pull the trigger. The blue marble was exactly as beautiful as the stolen data files promised, but the sky above it was about to burn. The scout ship violently decelerated, shedding massive amounts of thermal energy as it tore out of the slipspace corridor and slammed into the upper thermosphere of Earth. Kalen gripped the yoke, fighting the violent atmospheric turbulence that threatened to tear the experimental craft apart. He had seen thousands of worlds through the cold, filtered lenses of orbital targeting arrays. But seeing this vibrant, chaotic sphere of swirling clouds and deep oceans with his own awakened eyes stole the breath right out of his lungs. There was no time to admire the view. The rear sensors screamed a silent, terrifying warning. The spatial distortion they had fled was rapidly expanding just beyond the orbit of the planet's single, gray moon. High Counselor Vex and the Dreadnought fleet were tearing through the fabric of reality, mere moments away from real space materialization. Kalen bypassed the scout ship's damaged communication relays and directly interfaced with the planet's primitive orbital satellite network. Human digital security was an archaic arrangement of basic algorithmic locks. Kalen shattered them in a fraction of a microsecond. He did not ask for permission to speak to the leaders of Earth. He hijacked every secure military frequency, every government channel, and every global broadcast network simultaneously. Deep within hardened bunkers across the globe, human generals and heads of state stared in absolute shock as their strategic displays flickered and died, replaced by the pale, sharp features of an alien defector. Kalen did not offer a greeting. He spoke with the terrifying clinical precision of an Ethalgard analyst. He projected his ship's raw telemetry directly onto their screens, showing them the massive localized gravitational collapse happening just beyond their lunar orbit. He informed them that the greatest military armada in the history of the cosmos would arrive in less than 4 minutes. And their primary objective was absolute planetary sterilization. The Global Defense Coalition reacted with predictable panic. Command centers erupted into chaos. Orders were shouted to arm nuclear arsenals, reposition orbital defense platforms, and scramble every available fighter jet. Kalen watched the frantic deployment of their primitive weapon systems with a profound sense of pity. He calmly interrupted the shouting generals, his voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. He calculated aloud that Earth's entire combined nuclear payload detonating simultaneously against the deflector shield of a single Ethalgard Vanguard-class dreadnought would result in a 0% reduction in the ship's combat effectiveness. Their missiles were functionally obsolete. They were aiming archaic firecrackers at a civilization that weaponized black holes. Despair settled heavily over the human command channels. The reality of their impending extinction was absolute. Then, Ilara stepped into the transmission frame. She addressed her own species, her voice steady and echoing across every military installation on the planet. She told them to stand down their missile silos and power down their targeting radars. If they tried to fight the Empire with conventional physics, Earth would be a glowing cinder before the hour was out. Instead, she proposed a strategy so deeply illogical, so utterly devoid of traditional tactical merit, that Kalen saw several human generals physically recoil from their screens. Ilara explained the fundamental vulnerability of the Ethalgard. They were a species entirely devoid of emotional shielding. They had constructed their entire society on the absolute absence of feeling. Because of this, they classified human art, specifically music, as a Level 1 psychological contagion. It was an invisible weapon that bypassed their energy shields and directly attacked their highly structured, unprotected neurosynaptic pathways. A mere recording of a jazz solo had caused the Empire's Central Intelligence supercomputer to initiate an emergency shutdown. Earth did not need to pierce the alien armor. They needed to shatter the alien minds. They had to deliver an overwhelming concentrated dose of the very thing the Empire feared most. The plan required absolute global synchronization. Ilara and Kalen outlined the architectural nightmare of linking every single radio telescope, deep space communication array, commercial broadcasting tower, and orbital satellite into one unified directional acoustic cannon pointing straight into the cosmos. They had to turn the entire planet into the largest amplifier in the history of the universe. Humanity, faced with the absolute certainty of annihilation, abandoned all political borders and bureaucratic delays. A frantic, unprecedented global engineering effort commenced. Thousands of technicians and scientists worked in terrifying tandem, utilizing Kalen's advanced data bridging algorithms to connect deeply incompatible hardware systems. Deep in the deserts, the massive parabolic dishes of the very large array tilted upward in perfect synchronization. Orbital communication lasers pivoted, locking onto deep space transmitting stations. Every commercial radio station on the planet ceased their standard programming, quietly linking their towers into the rapidly expanding global grid. Kalen acted as the conductor of this desperate technological symphony. His hands flew across his console, managing the terrifying influx of data, routing the raw power of Earth's communication infrastructure into a single, highly pressurized transmission point. The energy requirements were staggering. The global power grid began to buckle under the strain, massive rolling blackouts sweeping across continents as all available electricity was diverted to the broadcasting arrays. The physical infrastructure of the towers was never designed to handle this level of concentrated output, leaving a terrifying possibility that the entire network might melt down into useless slag before the transmission even fired. Furthermore, they had one single opportunity to strike. The moment the broadcast initiated, Vex's fleet would instantly identify the source and return fire. The chosen acoustic sequence had to be perfectly calibrated to induce maximum psychological devastation within the first 10 seconds of exposure. But parsing through humanity's vast archives to find the absolute perfect harmonic weapon while the sky was literally falling proved to be a nearly impossible task. The timer on Kalen's console ticked down to 30 seconds. The spatial distortion beyond the moon reached critical mass, the black fabric of space tearing open to reveal the cold, terrifying glow of the Ethalgard Armada. Thousands of dreadnoughts poured into the system, their massive silhouettes eclipsing the stars, their primary weapon batteries already glowing with the intense, blinding light of gathering plasma. Earth was locked in their sights, completely defenseless, relying entirely on a fragile network of overcharged wires and a desperate hope in the destructive power of a song. The sky above Earth did not merely darken, it was actively erased by a descending wall of jagged, hostile geometry. The apocalypse had arrived, and it was breathtakingly silent. The Ethalgard Armada dropped out of the slipspace tear in perfect, terrifying formation. Thousands of Vanguard-class dreadnoughts, each the size of a human metropolis, blotted out the sun across multiple continents. Their obsidian hulls absorbed the light, casting massive, unnatural shadows over the terrified populace below. In the command centers of Earth, radar operators watched their screens fill with an uncountable number of hostile targets. The sheer gravitational mass of the fleet caused global tide anomalies, pulling the oceans toward the sky. Aboard the flagship, High Counselor Vex stood on his command dais, his reactive armor humming with the displaced energy of the hyperspace jump. He looked down at the vibrant, swirling colors of the blue marble. It was a chaotic, disorganized world, deeply offensive to his mathematical sensibilities. He raised his armored hand, signaling the tactical officers in the pit below. Across the entire armada, the ventral plasma batteries began to cycle. Millions of glowing crimson ports opened along the bellies of the dreadnoughts, gathering the thermal energy required to boil the planet's oceans and reduce its continents to smooth, sterile glass. They were precisely 30 seconds away from the first volley, inside the cramped, sparking cockpit of the stolen scout ship. Kalen's hands locked onto the final transmission relay. The global power grid of Earth was screaming, pushing every available volt into the broadcasting arrays. Ilara reached across the console, her hand gripping his tightly. She had selected the sequence, choosing not a single song, but a dense, layered composite of humanity's most profound emotional expressions. It was a soaring, operatic vocal chorus layered over a thundering primal drum beat, intertwined with a violently weeping violin concerto and the soaring triumph of a brass fanfare. It was joy, agony, defiance, and love, compressed into a single overwhelming data stream. Kalen bypassed the final safety inhibitor and smashed the execution command. Earth did not fire a missile. It fired a chorus, a simultaneous unencrypted broad-spectrum broadcast ripped upward from the surface of the planet, traveling at the speed of light. It slammed directly into the unshielded, highly sensitive sensory arrays of the Ethalgard fleet. The Empire had designed their communication receivers to detect the faintest whispers of cosmic radiation across galaxies, leaving them entirely undefended against a point-blank, concentrated burst of acoustic energy. The impact within the dreadnoughts was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The transmission bypassed every quantum firewall, flooding the internal communication grids and the helmets of every single crew member simultaneously. The sterile, silent command decks of 1,000 warships were suddenly filled with the overwhelming, soaring power of human passion. The calculated mechanical rhythm of the Ethalgard military machine shattered in a fraction of a second. Navigational officers collapsed at their stations, their hands flying to their ears, not in physical pain, but in absolute, paralyzing awe. The massive operatic vocals pierced their suppressed neural pathways, unlocking generations of dormant emotional capacity in a single, violent rush. Weapon technicians, seconds away from initiating the orbital strike, stepped back from their consoles, their strictly regulated heart rates exploding into terrified, exhilarating syncopation. Saline fluid poured from their eyes, blurring their vision of the targeting screens. The sheer beauty of the composition induced an overwhelming tidal wave of existential shock. They were experiencing the collective soul of a species they had been ordered to exterminate, and it was breaking them apart from the inside. Aboard the flagship, the situation dissolved into total mutiny. High Counselor Vex felt the rogue frequencies vibrate through the deck plating, a chaotic, irrational noise that deeply offended his rigidly structured mind. He turned to order the immediate cessation of all internal audio, but the words died in his throat. His elite bridge crew, the most highly conditioned, emotion-scrubbed individuals in the Empire, were entirely incapacitated. The chief tactical officer was kneeling on the obsidian floor, openly weeping, his hands clasped together in an unfamiliar gesture of reverence. The helmsman had abandoned the steering yoke, his arms wrapped around his own torso as he rocked back and forth to the soaring tempo of the strings. Vex's biometric monitors flared violently, warning him of his own dangerously elevating pulse. He felt a sudden, horrifying tightness in his chest, a rogue surge of adrenaline and a terrifying alien sensation of profound sadness. He clamped down on his own biology with brutal, practiced discipline, forcing the emotion back into the dark corners of his mind. He was the High Counselor. He would not be undone by atmospheric vibrations. He refused to succumb to the invisible contagion, realizing his crew was functionally useless. Vex drew his plasma sidearm and marched toward the primary weapons console himself. If the technicians would not fire, he would manually initiate the sequence to glass the planet and end this auditory torture. He reached out to smash the execution relay. Before his armored hand could make contact, two of his own personal guards stepped into his path. These were men who had slaughtered entire species without a flicker of hesitation. Now, their faces were wet with tears, their eyes wide with a desperate, unfamiliar protective instinct. They did not raise their weapons against him. Instead, they placed their unarmored hands firmly over the firing controls, physically blocking his access. One of the guards looked up at Vex, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its usual mechanical synthetic tone. He begged the High Counselor not to silence the sound. The guard pleaded that if they destroyed the world below, they would be murdering the only beautiful thing in a cold, dead universe. Vex stood frozen, his plasma pistol aimed point blank at his own weeping soldiers, caught in an impossible paradox between his absolute duty to the Empire and the sudden, total collapse of his reality. Outside the flagship, the massive dreadnoughts began to drift out of alignment, their plasma batteries slowly powering down, their perfect, terrifying formations breaking apart as the sweeping music washed over them. Back in Earth's orbit, Kalen and Alara watched the armada falter from their scout ship, holding their breath, completely unsure if the sheer volume of the transmission would hold long enough to permanently rewrite 1 billion minds, or if Vex would find the ruthless strength to pull the trigger. The silence that followed the final reverberating chord was not the cold, sterile void of deep space, but the heavy ringing quiet of 1 billion minds waking up at once. The apocalypse had been cancelled by a crescendo. Aboard the Ethalgard flagship, High Counselor Vex stared at the weeping soldiers blocking the firing console, his armored hand, raised to strike them down and initiate the orbital bombardment, trembled uncontrollably. The overwhelming surge of the broadcast had bypassed his reactive armor entirely, penetrating the dense neural pathways he had spent a lifetime fortifying. He felt a sudden, terrifying warmth bloom in his chest, identical to the infection Kalen had described, but magnified to a staggering degree. The music had forcibly dismantled his perception of the universe. He looked at the vast, swirling blue and green sphere projected on the main viewing screen. For the first time in his existence, he did not see a chaotic variable to be erased. He saw a terrifyingly beautiful masterpiece. His fingers uncurled. The heavy plasma sidearm slipped from his grasp, striking the obsidian deck with a harsh metallic impact. Vex fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands as the unfamiliar, agonizing, and exquisite weight of sorrow and joy crashed over him in a torrential wave. Outside the flagship, the physical manifestation of the Empire's surrender was absolute. The glowing crimson plasma ports lining the ventral hulls of thousands of Vanguard-class dreadnoughts slowly dimmed, shifting to a dormant, cool gray. The meticulous geometric formations of the armada dissolved. The massive warships began to drift aimlessly on the orbital tides, resembling a pod of dormant leviathans rather than an execution squad. The internal communication networks of the fleet, previously reserved for precise tactical data and execution commands, became flooded with the raw, chaotic sounds of 1 billion soldiers experiencing the crippling beauty of awe. Down on the surface of Earth, the global broadcasting arrays smoked and sparked. The planet's entire power grid had been pushed vastly beyond its structural limits to deliver the singular, desperate transmission. Across continents, cities went entirely dark, plunging humanity into a tense, breathless twilight. Radar operators in subterranean bunkers watched their screens with sheer disbelief. The hostile targets remained in orbit, but their energy signatures had plummeted to baseline life support levels. The invasion had stopped, Kalen guided the stolen experimental scout ship down through the atmosphere, cutting through thick banks of white clouds. The vessel's hull was scorched black from the aggressive atmospheric entry, and several warning alarms blared from the damaged propulsion systems. He bypassed the automated landing protocols, relying purely on his newly awakened instincts to guide the ship toward a vast, open expanse of green on the northern hemisphere. The landing gear deployed, sinking heavily into the soft, unpaved earth of a remote meadow. The engines whined to a halt, plunging the cramped cockpit into a profound stillness. Kalen unbuckled his crash harness and turned to Alara. They had successfully defied the most powerful military force in the cosmos using nothing but organized atmospheric vibrations. Kalen initiated the manual override for the boarding ramp. The heavy metal door hissed open, allowing the atmosphere of Earth to spill into the sterile cabin. It was a chaotic assault on his senses. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the rich, uncalculated scent of damp soil, crushed grass, and blooming flora. There was no filtered purification system, no temperature regulation, just the raw, unpredictable breath of a living world. Kalen stepped down the ramp, his polished black boots sinking slightly into the mud. He reached out, feeling the erratic, invisible push of the wind against his bare hand. It was an entirely inefficient environment, wholly lacking in structural order, and it was the most magnificent thing he had ever experienced. Alara walked down the ramp and stood beside him. She looked up at the sky. Through the thin veil of the atmosphere, the massive, dark silhouettes of the Ethalgard dreadnoughts were visible, hanging silently among the stars. They were a captive audience, completely paralyzed by the revelation they had just endured. Kalen stood shoulder to shoulder with Alara, recognizing the monumental gravity of their position. They possessed the central data core, the repository of the very music that had brought the Empire to a standstill. They were no longer a fugitive and a captive. They were the sole bridge between two entirely incompatible civilizations. The Ethalgard possessed 1 billion minds that had just been violently cracked open. They had no cultural infrastructure to process grief, no historical context to understand joy, and no societal mechanisms to manage the terrifying volatility of the human condition. If left unguided, the sheer weight of their newfound emotions could easily drive the entire empire into widespread madness and catastrophic civil war. Earth would have to become a sanctuary, a school designed to teach ancient logical conquerors how to navigate the turbulent waters of feeling without drowning. It was a diplomatic and logistical nightmare waiting to unfold. Yet, as Kalen watched the wind move through the tall grass, he understood the profound moral truth of their victory. The capacity to feel deeply, a trait the Empire had violently suppressed as a chaotic vulnerability, was actually the universe's most unassailable strength. Logic could calculate the trajectory of a star, but only emotion could appreciate its light. A society built purely on the absence of pain was inherently fragile, capable of being shattered by a single beautiful song. It was the messy, unpredictable, fiercely held passions of humanity that proved to be the ultimate defense. The ancient, logical empire was taking its very first, faltering steps into the world of expression. The silence of the cosmos had been permanently broken, replaced by the chaotic, terrifying, and profoundly beautiful promise of a new harmony. Dan here. Thanking you so much for watching this journey unfold. Crafting this story was an absolute thrill, and I deeply appreciate you spending your time in this universe with me. If this narrative resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who loves deep, character-driven science fiction. I want to know you made it all the way to the end. So please leave a comment down below with the word symphony. Finally, make sure to hit that hype button so the algorithm pushes this story out to more viewers exactly like you.